Redditors born before 2001, where were you on September 11th?
2 WTC 67th floor. Yes, that's correct. Was halfway down the stairwell when the building shook. Didn't know what it was, so continued to go all the way down. I stupidly did not exit on the concourse level but the street level. I could have easily been killed from falling concrete or bodies. I saw some unpleasant things but was not exposed to it for days, weeks or years, so don't think it had a LT effect on me. Didn't hang around and left the area before either tower collapsed. So, all my decisions and actions saved me that day miraculously.
1 WTC 40th floor. Okay, I'll try not to make it too long. My office was on the north side, so I sat with my right shoulder facing the window. The plane came in right over my head, I didn't see it. I stood up and went to the window. A couple of points: 1, the windows were floor to ceiling, and 2, the towers were built to sway in the wind. As I went to the window, the force of the impact had made the tower sway one way, so it started to sway back and I felt like I was going towards the window. I stepped back and then a few seconds later a ton of debris started falling. I ran out of my office into the cube farm and saw all these faces with massive wide eyes starting at me over the cubicle walls. I shouted for everybody to evacuate. We hit the stairwell and made the first 3 floors in just a few seconds. I think we nearly jumped entire flights, it felt that fast, then came to screaming halt as the stairwells filled. Another side note, emergency stairwells are not big enough. And one more side note, my boss's boss did a walk around our floor to make sure everybody was out. The man has balls of steel and will forever have my utmost respect. So I stopped in the stairwell and started to think. I had one of those newfangled Blackberries that you could send texts and emails on. I hit up my guys on the trading floor in the World Financial Center. We've had an explosion, look out the window and tell me if I should go up or down. They could see the towers. He told me, plane hit above you, go down. Emailed my wife, in Midtown, to tell her I was okay and evacuating. We swapped some emails as she was watching the TV in her office. So the slow descent started. We ended up single file against the wall as the firefighters came up the inside of the stairwell. I am guessing they didn't make it out. Saw some burns victims come down, won't get graphic but it was not nice. Got another text a little while later from my guys at World Fi, second tower's been hit, get the F out now. I showed it to my colleague and we agreed we had to keep it quiet to avoid mass panic. Eventually got to the bottom. 6 inches of water all over. The elevators looked like sheets of aluminum foil that had been punched. I think the fuel from the plane exploded down the elevator shafts. Got to an exit and there was an overhang. There was a cop bobbing out and in. He got you ready and told me to put my arms over my head for protection from falling stuff. He waited for a break and shouted, "Run." I sprinted across the street and then stopped to turn around and see just what was going on. Walked several blocks north and east I think, and believe it or not, found a bus going north. I guess the man upstairs was on my side that day. Ended up in Midtown at my wife's office watching the day unfold. Late in the day, we walked to the Hudson River and got a ferry across to Weehawken. We lived in Hoboken at the time, so we walked home from there. Finally went back to ground zero, for the first time, 2 years ago. My kids are all old enough to understand. Was much harder than I thought it was going to be, if I am honest.
I was meant to be at work on Wall Street, and would have been coming out of the Fulton Street station, right by the WTC, when the first plane hit. However, I took my mother to NYC for a surprise, first trip there since 1968, we live in New Zealand, so I had a week off work to spend with her. We flew in on September 9, 2001. On the morning of the 10th, I said, "What do you want to do first?" She said, "When I was last here, the Twin Towers were being built, and I thought when I left that I'd love to go up to the top when they are finished. So, I'd like to do that." That's how I found myself standing on the observation deck of one of the Twin Towers at around 3 p.m. on September 10, 2001. The next morning, I looked out my apartment window. We were staying a 10-minute walk from the WTC, and saw that the towers were on fire. I genuinely thought I was dreaming and tried to wake myself up.
Truly. I was driving to meet friends for coffee and heard about the first plane on the radio. I assumed it was a little 2 to 4-seater. Got to the coffee shop and everyone was there except Julie. She was at the barber shop across the lane watching the TV. She came over with wild panic in her eyes, tears pouring down her face. Her husband had a breakfast meeting on the top of Tower 1 at 8:30 a.m. He was an antitrust lawyer in the middle of a big case. She didn't have a cell phone, so I gave her mine. His just went to voicemail. She was shaking from head to toe. Couldn't reach her husband. She called his office, and no one who was on the New York team had checked in yet. Then Tower 1 fell. I never, ever want to witness a person in the state she was in. I can't begin to describe the terror she was living. It was a palpable, fierce, raw emotion that consumed her entire being. I held her toddler in my arms, who sat silently with eyes the size of oranges, watching his mother devolve into this electric pain. I said she should call home, because if he was okay, maybe he would call her there. She called. Suddenly it was like all her bones turned to rubber, and she fell into the chair behind her. He left her a message, "He's okay." His team was late. The first plane hit as they were walking into the building. Then, we all are together. I lost my shoe and my cell phone. I'm using Kathy's cell. Then, we have to get out of here. There's chunks of plane falling. Oh God, there's bodies falling. I have to move or I will get hit. Then she didn't hear from him for 4 hours. 6 months later, me and her were shopping at the mall buying her husband a passport, wallet, etc. She stopped and grabbed my arm and said, "I am buying stuff to replace things my husband lost in a terrorist attack. This is so surreal." It was. Still is.
Boating on a lake with friends, disconnected from the world. We had no idea what happened until we all got home. Thought it was weird that every gas station had a long line.
I was in my first year of high school, Australia. It was about 3 a.m., and I could hear the TV on. Odd as my family had all gone to bed many hours previously, and TV wasn't allowed before school. I stumbled out to the lounge room to find my father standing rod straight, eyes glued to the screen. He didn't look at me, just lifted his arm in a gesture to get me to his side. We stood there together in horror as the news broadcast the second tower falling. It was absolutely surreal. I feel that same sense of disconnection from reality every day now watching the news from the States. My heart's still with you all.
Got up from a night shift to go to the bathroom and my brother happened to be watching it in his bedroom. I glanced in the door and said, "What's this crap you're watching?" I genuinely thought he was watching a movie, and I remember him vividly saying, "I was just about to wake you up, it's really happening, bro."
Can relate. I was in Australia, it was 9 or 10 p.m., and I had just gotten home and my then partner was watching it on TV. I asked him what movie he was watching as the special effects were amazing. He turned to me, white as a sheet, and told me, it wasn't a movie. I immediately called a friend in Colorado and told her how awful it was, and she had no idea what I was talking about, so she put on the TV.
I was in a hotel in Midtown. It felt like a completely different world than below 14th. I was there with my aunt, she was footing the bill, and every night we got back to our hotel on 59th and 7th and there were fresh baked cookies by the elevator. She said, this must have been what it was like in London during the Blitz. Her husband, who was in London during the Blitz, said, absolutely not.
My high school, which was on the flight path for an Air Force base. Hearing the entire squadron of fighter jets take off in quick succession in a way that they had never done before, and not knowing why, was absolutely unnerving.
From Northern Ireland, I remember being in our living room doing homework with the child sitter, and watching Ed, and Eddie, when my parents flew in the front door and changed the channel to BBC News, and a clip of the towers burning.
From the UK too. Was still on university holidays at the time between my second and third year. Had a typical lazy holiday morning, got out of bed at about midday, had some lunch and watched Neighbours. Was about to go and do something when the daytime TV schedule was interrupted by a BBC News bulletin saying both towers of the WTC were on fire. From that point on, I watched it unfold on TV. When reports came in of the third plane hitting the Pentagon, I thought WW3 was about to kick off. It was clear this was not an accident. Watched the towers collapse live. I texted my brother, who was at college, to tell him both WTC towers had been destroyed by planes hitting them, and he didn't believe me. We went to the local pub that evening for a drink, and everyone in there was just talking about it to each other in disbelief. I'll never forget that day. People often talk about remembering exactly where they were when they heard JFK was shot. 9/11 is a similar kind of event in my life.
In elementary school, we all got huddled in the big central area in the middle of the classrooms. All the adults were watching the news on one of those roll-away box TV cart things. I remember they were trying to decide to send us home or not, and the logistics of having hundreds of kids during a time of crisis. I think we did get sent home a couple hours early. Watched it on the news with my parents, people jumping out of buildings and such. Everyone was super scared. I almost wish I could thank the teachers that we were in the care of. They really stepped up in a way that wasn't expected of them. They could have just fled to their own families. They probably weren't much older than I am now. Crazy to think about.
Freshman year of college. In the common room of my dorm floor. Only the second person awake, just after my roommate, who woke me up saying, "A plane just hit the World Trade Center." Frantically calling my mom, a flight attendant who was in the air at the time, over and over, trying to get through to her phone. Calling her flight attendant friends. My brother. Anyone who might know what her flight plan that day was. She got through to me about 2 hours later. They grounded her flight at the closest airport, Raleigh, and kept them on board for a bit before letting them off. She was in a car with a stranger who heard her talking to my brother, who was telling her that I was panicked and trying to get a hold of her. He asked where she needed to go and she told him where I was, Syracuse. He happened to be driving to Boston and offered to drive her. In a move she would never, ever do on a normal day, she got in a car with a complete stranger who drove her hours out of his way to get her back to me. We stayed close friends with that man and talked to him often, meeting up with him any time we happened to be in each other's vicinity. He passed away this past summer. It was the first time in 23 years we didn't speak to each other on that day. Felt weird. I'll be forever thankful for him on that day. I needed her.
I was on the train heading into NYC. The first plane hit right as my train was pulling in to pick us up. A friend's dad called her and told her not to get on the train, but I was already on with another friend, so we missed getting off. I found out what was happening with a call to a friend who I knew was home with her kids. The second plane hit when we were on the phone. I could have gotten off in Newark, but for some reason I didn't. I made it into Penn Station, heard a police officer say, "The next train out is the last train out." I jumped on it and saw the towers fall as we were pulling out of the tunnel back on the NJ side.
Working security in a courthouse minutes away. I was brushing my teeth when I felt first plane fly over. It flew low enough to be felt in my building. Radio call of "Fire." Fire went out seconds later. Replies of "Location" weren't answered. I ran downstairs to exit the building when I saw damaged tower. That began one of the longest days of my life.
Would love to read more if you are comfortable reliving those moments through text.
I can share some of my memories of that day. I have a few that are still very vivid to me. After the South Tower was hit, we realized the first plane was not an accident. A rumor had spread after the North Tower was hit, that is was a small Cessna-type plane that was involved. Of course not everyone saw the first plane and correct info was hard to find. Fire alarms were sounded and we evacuated the courthouse and worked perimeter security. Then there was a steady stream of thousands of people walking up north past the courthouse after the towers fell. Many were covered in the gray dust that came from the downed towers. Their faces were mostly in shock or scared or angry. Although the streaming crowd was thick, I noticed an opening and in the middle space was an Arabic woman wearing a flowing robe and hijab. She was also covered in the dust but her face was visible. The look of pure horror was visible on her face. People seemed to avoid her space as they walked by her. I felt sorry for her. Later that afternoon it was decided that we would help in the relief efforts. Pace University had an auditorium nearby and it was being set up as a triage center. We went there and were asked to carry medical supplies inside. A call had gone out for all NYC ambulances to drop off whatever supplies they had there. So the ambulance pulled up, literally threw supplies out, body bags, bandages, etc. We then waited for survivors for a couple of hours. Not one survivor was brought to triage center. I think it was then that the enormity of what had happened hit us. We worked the bucket brigade for a few days after that. People formed lines and walked up into ground zero. We would pick up pieces of metal and pass it down to the next man, trying to clear areas to help evacuate people we expected to find. We didn't find anyone alive. Search dogs arrived that day and went straight to work. After a day or so I heard the dogs were sad because they didn't find anyone alive. NYC firefighters starting staging rescues by hiding in the disaster for the dogs to find them, thereby lifting the dogs' spirits. I remember that around the third day some local lady showed up and handed out booties for the search dogs because they were getting their paws cut of sharp metal shards in the mound. It took a couple of days for a security perimeter to be established around ground zero. Up until then anyone could go down there. And they did. All types of people volunteered for bucket brigades. They came down to contribute water, food, batteries, anything that the first responders could use. To be clear, I was not a first responder. My group didn't arrive at ground zero until hours after the towers fell.
I was on a business trip for a meeting halfway across the country from my home. We went into crisis mode because where I worked was an organization that would be involved in emergencies at the national level. Fortunately, we had most of the people together in one location, which allowed us to work effectively without the modern web meeting tools today. As soon as I heard that all the flights were grounded, I called the rental car and told them that I was changing my drop-off location to back home. The woman couldn't understand why I would want to return it thousands of miles away. But I knew how it was going to play out. After the meeting, I drove back halfway across the country, dropping colleagues off at their homes along the way. Meanwhile, we spend the time in the car having meeting calls with the one phone that had a speaker function sitting on the console.